Good morning to those on the East Coast of the United States. Good afternoon or evening to those zooming in from around the world. I'm Jane Harman, President and CEO of the Wilson Center, and want to welcome you to today's Middle East Program special event on Joe Biden's tough challenges in Iran. An extraordinary group of former ambassadors, thought leaders, and other experts are zooming in to this conversation, and I surely hope that one of them is Marissa Horma, the director of our Middle East program, who became a mother for the second time last week. Welcome to Sofia. Some worry that President Trump may use his time left to command a last-minute strike on Iran. Hopefully not, but it is surely clear that President-elect Joe Biden's biggest foreign policy challenge, or one of his biggest, in the Middle East will be Iran. Biden has already committed to re-entering the JCPOA, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, but working a way back into the deal will prove difficult, as Tehran has expressed no interest in deal-making beyond the original terms of the agreement. From the Iranian vantage point, President Trump's 2018 withdrawal from the 2015 deal and the administration's maximum pressure campaign against Iran eroded any willingness by Iran to work with the West. In addition, hardliners made big gains in Iran's 2020 parliamentary elections, winning back the parliamentary majority, largely in response to mounting US pressure on the Rouhani administration. On the other hand, and I know this will be discussed, some of us who were supporters of the JCPOA in the US and in the Middle East would love it to be stronger, to cover missiles, to cover inspections of military sites, to ban acquisition of conventional weapons, and to curb Iran's malign activity. That's a long and tough list, and I'd be interested to hear what everyone thinks. In the past several years, let me put this on the table, the US and Iran have exchanged blows. The global oil supply was disrupted when Iran targeted Saudi Aramco oil fields with rockets in September 2019. Several months later, mobs led by Iranian-backed Hezbollah harassed the US embassy in Baghdad, and a US drone strike, we all know this, killed the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps' top commander, Qasem Soleimani, a year ago. The marks of escalation are unmistakable. President-elect Biden and his nominee for Secretary of State, Tony Blinken, will have their hands full. The Wilson Center is ready to lead the conversation on what promises to be 4 challenging years dealing with one of America's most resilient adversaries. And here to moderate today's event is the amazing Steve Inskeep, author and host of NPR's Morning Edition and Up First. I call him, I've told him this, the first male voice I hear every morning. Steve will be navigating the discussion among our panelists, one of whom is our newly minted chair of our Middle East program, Ambassador Jim Jeffrey. Jim was recalled from retirement as career ambassador to serve as the Secretary of State's special representative for Syria engagement and special envoy for the Global Coalition to Defeat ISIS. He is a personal friend and brings enormous experience and insight to his new position. We're also joined by the magnificent Robin Wright, a USIP Wilson Center Distinguished Fellow, contributing columnist to The New Yorker, author and editor of 8 books, and editor-in-chief of the Iran Primer, the world's #1 online resource on Iran, which we proudly post on the Wilson website. I often thank Robin for telling me what I think about the issues. And finally, we give a special welcome to our outside guest, Jared Blank, currently a senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and formerly the State Department coordinator for monitoring the implementation of the JCPOA. With that, I will listen while our all-stars carry the conversation and present some ideas for how the new administration can navigate these tricky waters. Welcome to all of you.
Jane, thank you very much. It's a real honor to be here. I really appreciate the opportunity to mostly listen to this incredible group of people. You're very lucky to have Ambassador Jeffrey, who's one of our most experienced diplomats, and we're very lucky to have this panel. And I want to lead with Robin Wright. because that is what I commonly do when I've had an opportunity to visit Iran. If I get a visa now and again, the first thing I do is call Robin to find out what I might expect when I land, and people to talk to and that sort of thing. And Robin, let me begin with a basic question. Can the United States simply call up Iran, send a note to Iran and say we're back in the nuclear deal and go from there? Oh, Robin, I think you'll need to unmute yourself, I'm afraid. We're still not hearing you, Robin. We need to, here we go.
Thanks. I'm unmuted myself and they muted me again. So anyway, the answer is yes and no. Yes, the president can notify Iran, notify the other 5 major powers that negotiated the deal to that it's back on, that we're rejoining. The problem is so much has happened over the last 2 years since President Trump walked away from the deal, that it's going to require both sides to take significant steps. And that's where it starts to get messy. I'm going to leave it to Jared to use his best line about compliance. But basically, the US wants Iran to pull back from the breaches, the increase of its nuclear uranium stockpile, reducing the level of enrichment. In turn, Iran wants the United States to lift sanctions. Well, you know, this is where it's the one bit of leverage the United States has. And there's a huge debate in Washington and elsewhere about whether Joe Biden should keep some of the sanctions that Donald Trump imposed as part of the maximum pressure campaign in order to get Iran to comply on other issues. So what you basically have are 3 different baskets. The first basket is one over process, and that is how does this play out? Who moves first? Who lifts sanctions first? Who rolls back their breaches first? So forth. So that's process questions. Then you get to the substance, and are there going to be any modifications to the original nuclear deal, particularly on the timelines that are called sunset clauses, that tell Iran when it can resume certain activities? One of the sunset clauses is already expired, and that means that Iran can buy conventional weapons that it has been banned from buying. And then there's this third basket of all the other things that have loomed between the United States and Iran, including its missile program, its proxies, and its meddling in the Middle East, support for extremist groups, and its a deep human rights abuses. And so do you keep some of those sanctions on to try to leverage these other issues? And do you try to bring in any of those other issues into the negotiations? So the format, there's an awful lot to be decided. So much has changed. It's not just flicking a switch to go back. We can declare that we're interested, but how does that happen? And so just getting through that first basket is going to be a real challenge.
Well, let's pick up on a phrase you used, Robin. You said so much has happened in the last 4 years, which is a phrase we could essentially use regardless of the topic we were discussing today, but we happen to be discussing Iran. So Jared, let me ask you, what has happened, if you'll just review for us, what has happened in the last 4 years that has changed the circumstances, changed the situation of Iran relative to the countries with which it made this deal?
Well, So I think that there, of course, changes on, if we maybe break it into 3 sides. On the Iranian side, the Iranians demonstrated a fair degree of patience in terms of not responding immediately to the Trump administration's provocations, both under and outside of the deal. So the first couple of years of the Trump administration, you saw an increasing litany of sanctions that were not specifically barred by the JCPOA, but certainly cut deeply into the economic advantages that Iran anticipated receiving under the deal, and Iran stayed in compliance. And then, in the spring of 2018, you have the Trump administration actually formally pulling out of the deal and applying increasingly intense sanction pressure that eventually became more intense than the pressure that was placed on Iran even before the negotiation of the deal. Again, Iran stayed basically in compliance with the deal, I think trying to establish exactly how much the United States, how much the Trump administration was going to do. And then finally, after almost a year of Trump administration sort of gradual withdrawal from the deal, Iran started responding with its own measured withdrawals. And so now you've got Iran with excess enriched uranium, uh, uranium enriched to higher levels than are permitted, excess centrifuges, and also advances in their research and development program that are faster than were permitted under the terms of the deal. So in Iran, you've got a variety of steps that they've taken, some of which easily reversible, number of centrifuges, amount of uranium, some less easily reversible, like whatever they've learned from their R&D program. On the United States side, you've got obviously the resumption of the sanctions that were lifted by the JCPOA, but then you've also got the application of other sanctions not specifically addressed by the JCPOA, which, if in place, even if there were full JCPOA sanctions relief, would certainly complicate any private sector interactions with Iran from third country actors, European, Asian, etc. And then the last is that if you look at the other actors in the deal, the Europeans, the Russians, and the Chinese, I think going into U.S. withdrawal from the JCPOA, the big question was, to what extent will these countries be able to act economically independently? So to what extent will they be able to say, whatever the United States is threatening vis-a-vis sanctions, secondary sanctions, which apply to our companies, we are going to continue to do business with Iran? And the answer has proven not very much. The Europeans, our Asian allies, have really stopped doing business with Iran out of concern for the possibility of US sanctions. And frankly, even the Russians and the Chinese have been substantially more limited, I think, than some analysts might have predicted before 2018 in how much they've been willing to test the Trump administration in doing business with Iran.
Jared, before I turn to Ambassador Jeffrey, I want to follow up on something. Robin writes excellent article in The New Yorker, which is a great summary the other day of where things stand. Had a number in there that I hadn't seen or hadn't thought about. She referred to the breakout time, the amount of time Iran would need to make a bomb if they just decided they're going to go for it. It used to be a year. She writes that it's 3 months now. How does that change the circumstance?
So just a technical correction. The breakout time, as the US government uses the phrase, is not how long it would take Iran to build a bomb or a nuclear explosive device. It's how much time it would take to accumulate enough fissile material to do so.
Thank you.
So in the US government has sort of generally made the assumption that because we don't exactly know what progress they've made or did make before 2003 in their weaponization research, let's just assume that the restriction here is their fissile material. But the fact is that on some level, we know that they do need more time to actually weaponize the uranium or plutonium if they had it. So you are exactly right, though, that the JCPOA increased the amount of time that it would take them to collect that fissile material to a year or more. It's now down to, let's say, 3 or 4 months, and it's falling quickly because the Iranians have started to enrich to 20%, enrich uranium to 20%. And the physics of this is that getting from 0% to 20%, or from natural to 20%, takes 80% of the work. Getting from 20% to a weapons grade of like 90 or 95% only takes 20% of the work. So as they start, this only has been a week now, but as they start to accumulate an appreciable amount of that higher, that 20% enriched uranium, you're going to see that breakout time calculation fall from maybe 3 or 4 months to shorter and shorter, which certainly is an Iranian effort to create some urgency and try to make sure that there's some solutions, such as a compliance return to the deal.
Ambassador Jeffrey, if you're advising a president of the United States and that breakout time starts getting very near zero, if you have committed that Iran must never have a weapon, is there a point where you begin to feel pressure to do something militarily about that if you haven't done something diplomatically?
That depends on your assessment of whether Iran wants to hold the threat of moving quickly to have a nuclear device versus Iran's real intention to do so. that would be based very much on the intelligence that people have. And there's pretty good overall intelligence on Iran's, certainly its technical nuclear capabilities. The intentions of its leadership, there's much less certainty about. It would be a very nervous situation for any administration. It's also the situation, of course, that we were in from 2009 to 2016 when we finally got the thing. Iran had, in 2009, it already had 1,200 kilograms of 20% enriched uranium. And as Jared just explained, that gets you very close to having that capability. I think people said it would be a matter of weeks for Iran to have that amount of 95% enriched uranium to move forward during that whole period. The Obama administration decided that the way to deal with that was not military pressure, although they did have that we will strike if you actually develop a weapon policy, but rather to negotiate. The Trump administration didn't really tackle that question because they weren't faced with it up to the present.
So let's put this in the context of the region that you know so well, Ambassador, and how that has changed in the last few years. I'll state the obvious. This very expert group of people listening will know that a large part of the question here is Iran's role in the region, whether it's going to be a dominant player, how dominant it's going to be, what it will do, what the United States can stop it from doing. How has the region changed in 4 years?
It has changed dramatically, but I want to actually take it back to 2013. While the Obama administration, senior leadership, particularly then Vice President Biden, denied it repeatedly publicly, there is a general assumption, not by everybody, but by many of the people who followed Iran policies and the nuclear account over the past decade, that the Obama administration at least hoped that this agreement, the JCPOA, would be transformational. That, to quote Henry Kissinger, Iran would, by embracing this and realizing it could work with the West, make the decision to be a country and not a cause. What we saw from 2013, when the initial agreement was signed between the E3+3 and Iran, and 2018, when the Trump administration broke out, was a massive expansion of Iranian activities, aggression, and expansion throughout the region. If you look at the situation in Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and Yemen in 2013 versus in 2018, you will see what Iran was capable of doing. The Obama administration did nothing to stop that expansion on the ground. And frankly, the Trump administration in the first 18 months did very little as well. Then in 2018, the Trump administration came up with this new maximum pressure policy with 4 elements. The first is, of course, to pull out of the JCPOA and then imply these crushing sanctions that Jared talked about, that have had an effect, a dramatic one, on Iran's economy, and a pretty significant effect on its ability to fund its allies and partners and militias throughout the region. Second, and I choose this verb carefully, contest Iran's presence in 3 of the 4 countries, Iraq, Syria, and Yemen, and to not assist Lebanon very much in its economic travails. The third element was to build up a very tight regional alliance that for the first time would include formally Israel as well as the Sunni Arab states to push back against Iran. And the fourth element was to, by pulling out of the JCPOA, and this is the downside, run the risk that Iran would move closer to a breakout capability, which is exactly what happened. The administration simply saw the JCPOA as a wasting resource given the time restraints we've talked about, and thought all in all that there was no other way to do the maximum pressure campaign and stay within the JCPOA. And so it opted for the policy that it's carried out for the last 2 years.
I want to try to summarize what you're telling me. I think you're telling me that the JCPOA, in terms of limiting Iran's nuclear capability, worked. In terms of calming, pacifying, stabilizing the region, just didn't work, is what you're telling me. And go on. Exactly.
And in fact, very senior officials in the Trump administration said, over the period of time that it was set up to do, it's worked very well, and people very much like the inspection regime. But again, they had a problem with Iran's behavior in the region, and they couldn't square the circle of dealing with that effectively and to convince our various partners and allies, while at the same time staying in the JCPOA. That's why they had the 18-month back and forth on whether there was a way to fix the JCPOA from their standpoint. In the end, neither Iran nor the European partners wanted to fix it, so out they went.
So do we now have a policy, does the Biden administration inherit a policy that's not successfully containing the nuclear program and is attempting to push back on Iran in the region, but not necessarily stabilizing the region? Is that a fair summary?
No, I use the word contest because I wouldn't say roll back or win. What I would say is, from my perspective, and it's only one perspective, but it's in dealing with the leaders in the region pretty extensively, is that the fact that we contested Iran in the region pretty effectively, they didn't gain a whole lot. Again, using my timeline from 2018 to 2020, their situation in Yemen, Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon on balance is probably not as good as it was in 2018. So they pushed back and basically got stalemates in all of those places. The fact that they pushed back, formed an alliance, put Iran under very strong economic pressure, and essentially declared Iran an outlaw, a threat to the region, was the driving force in creating the Abraham Accords and the overall alliance that they've put together. So they would say that they have stabilized the region, or we would say, and when I was in the administration, we've stabilized the region. We haven't rolled Iran back. We've done this at the cost of a riskier nuclear situation with Iran. That has to be acknowledged.
So Robin, let's come back to you. When you look at the way the Biden administration views this situation that it will inherit, what do you think the administration likes and clearly doesn't like about President Trump's approach in the region the last few years? Oh, we got to undo the mic again. Robin, we're not hearing you, so we'll need to undo your mic again.
Yeah, sorry, I'm not muting myself, so somehow the boys are. So what does it like and what doesn't it like? I think there's a lot that the new administration doesn't like. And I think the array of sanctions, some of them are a little bit gratuitous. Some target institutions like the Revolutionary Guards that have been a real challenge to the United States. But would any of those sanctions actually have made a huge difference? I think one of the hardest part for the administration actually is going to be time. We're getting into a period where not just the United States, but Iran is also about to go through a huge transition. And so the Biden administration has maybe 6 to 8 weeks to get this process going, to get a sense of that both sides are complying, that the breaches are beginning to be rolled back. Some of the sanctions are lifted, maybe not all of them, but that the process is well underway, because Iran then goes into Nowruz, which is the big celebration where the country closes down for 2 weeks. I mean, it literally closes down. And it comes out of that and goes straight into a presidential campaign. And Iran is very lucky. Its presidential campaign is a couple of months long, from April until June. And the new president will be inaugurated in August. So there needs to be a burst of activity to try to get a process moving. And then, of course, there may be a long period where things have to wait until you have a new government in place. But in the meantime, the reason that's so important is that what happens between the US and Iran could have an enormous impact on who is elected president. The current president, Hassan Rouhani, was elected partly in large part, on his platform to get a nuclear deal, to engage with the United States, a radical position given a revolution that was as much against the United States as it was against the monarchy. And so the election debate will be framed a lot on, was the nuclear deal worth it? Or did Iran end up suffering because of the incredible sanctions that, of course, been magnified by the the toll of COVID-19 because Iran was one of the epicenters. So there's an urgency to move to get something going. And I think that's going to be the hardest part. And so that's going to challenge to get back to your original question, it's going to challenge the Biden administration to figure out, how do you comply? What do you give in order to get, or what do you ask the Iranians to do in exchange for what? And I think that's the real crisis, that we all know what Joe Biden wants to do. The question is, how do you do it? And how do you do it in a very small time frame?
There's so much to follow up on here. Let me stick with the Iranian point of view for a moment. You're telling me that they have this limited period of time in which they could engage with the United States, and it could have political effects inside Iran. I think it is safe to say that nothing is going to move forward if the clerical leadership is not interested in doing that. For the reasons you said, do you believe that Iran is willing to take another chance on the United States, which pulled out of this agreement one time?
I do. And there is a feisty debate, but one of the things, there's kind of a misunderstanding of the Iranian political system. We think of just the supreme leader or the president, and in fact, they have a national security structure that is in many ways even more vibrant than ours is, because it brings together, whether it's the head of the Revolutionary Guards and the U.S. educated foreign minister, a representative from the Supreme Leader's office. So you have many different, whether it's the ideological or the political or the military/security elements, they all come together. And under the current national security advisor, a man named former general Ali Shamkhani, grew up part of his life in Los Angeles. There has been a feisty debate, but they have all agreed, and they then take their position to the supreme leader. And the foreign minister has told me multiple times that 95% of the time the supreme leader has signed off on everything, and the other 5% he asks questions and goes along with it. I think Iran is partly because of sanctions. I think Rouhani, while he's still there, and he's not part of the election system, they have a 2-term limit too. And so that's why this transition in Iran is so important, that he wants to see what he initiated and succeeded in getting. He wants that to be his legacy. He doesn't want it to be failure. And so they will move heaven and earth in that little bitty time frame they have to try to see if they can come. Now, they're going to exact their price. They keep talking about they've lost $250 billion because of economic sanctions, and they want compensation. Well, nobody's going to give that to them from the United States. The Europeans could do some deals with them, give them a sense that, there's economic activity again with the outside world or with the West. So there are ways around that, but something's got to happen fast.
Well, what is possible in that 6 to 8 week period? I'm presuming they can't fully negotiate the technicalities of getting the deal up and running again. So what are Iranians who want back in the deal realistically looking for? A gesture from the United States, a couple of lifted sanctions? What is the United States thinking? What's the new administration thinking about giving them? Is that how this has to work, that the United States makes a gesture first?
Well, this is Jarrett's great line about
we'll go to Jarrett next. Yeah.
All right, compliance for compliance. And as he points out very rightly, what is compliance? It's a great term, but it's not a simple idea. It's something that involves undoing nuclear breaches. It involves lifting sanctions. Foreign Minister Zarif has said in an interview with one of the Iranian papers that the US or President Biden could lift sanctions with 3 executive orders. Jarrett would probably know the logistics of that better than I do, but Iran will want to say, look, you're the ones who walked away from the deal, you've got to act first. And it may be that, I think through the Europeans and so forth, there's likely to be some process that is kind of step by step and that gets things going so that there's momentum, there's meat, there's commitment, and there's goodwill again.
Okay, Jarrett, let's suppose the new president called you up and said, what are my options? What can I do here? What are some options for the new president to get started?
Well, so at this point, both President-elect Biden and the Iranian leadership have said that they want a compliance for compliance return to the JCPOA. And as Robin said, there are complications in terms of exactly what that means and how you go about it. I don't think we need to exaggerate. So there are complications, they're not impossibilities. I think my guess is that it would probably take, in the range of weeks, maybe a month for Iran to come back fully into compliance if they chose to do so. As Robin suggested, U.S. compliance in some ways is simpler because it's as opposed to having to deal with physical material the way the Iranians have to. We would need to essentially issue executive orders and other sanctions mechanisms which are on paper. In some ways, what we have to do is more complicated just because there's so much of it, and the administration would have to review precisely what is necessary in order to realistically come into compliance and what they're willing to do, because there is such a kind of tangle of sanctions, some of which would have to be lifted and some not. But you could imagine a situation where a conversation about what the process back into compliance could go fairly quickly. And then if that were the case, then the timeline that Robin lays out, certainly extremely ambitious, and especially ambitious given all of the pressures in both Washington and in Tehran on other issues. It's not out of the question. If I could also, just before I hand back over, respond quickly to something that Jim said when he talked about, was the deal premised on the idea of a broader Iranian transformation? And actually, I get this question a lot, and I always refer back to an interview, Steve, that you conducted with President Obama at the time, where you asked this question, and his answer was, this is a good deal if you think Iran is open to change. It's also a good deal if you think that Iran is implacably opposed to the United States and the West and our values, because it is a deal that, if successfully implemented or re-implemented, contains the Iranian nuclear challenge. And in doing so, it addresses, what for a very long time there was broad international and bipartisan agreement was the most important risk to the United States. Now, you could ask a question, does that deal then make it easier or harder for us to deal with all of the other issues that Jim and Robin have identified, whether it's the region or ballistic missiles or anything else? And I think that, the fact that the Trump administration has had 4 years of kind of coasting on the nuclear accomplishments of the JCPOA has not been able to really, I think, make progress in those areas. And now you're in a place where you've run out of room in terms of the previous accomplishments of the JCPOA. You either need to get back into a nuclear deal or not. I think it's a pretty strong indication that getting, that releasing those limits on Iran's nuclear program does not make it easier to deal with all of the other concerns that we have about Iran.
How does it complicate the situation, if at all, Jarrett, that the other things have happened in the last few years that Ambassador Jeffrey mentioned? The United States has pressured Iran on other fronts, contested, I believe was his word, on other fronts. Does that make it harder for the Iranians to make an agreement now? Does it make it easier for the United States to make an agreement? Does it make it politically easier for an agreement to be sustained in the United States? How does it change things?
So, I think that the politics of this is probably extremely difficult on both sides. Certainly, we all know that the politics of Iran is, poisonous in Washington. And so we are coming to a diplomatically agreed conclusion where there are concessions on all sides. It's very easy in Washington to pick apart those concessions and ignore the advantages that the United States has accrued. On the Iranian side, I think you would certainly imagine that the failure of the JCPOA to deliver the benefits that Iran, that the United States committed to Iran, while Iran has been, again, relatively measured in the way that they've responded in their nuclear program, I think getting back into the deal or into any deal, I think, is going to open up anybody who tries to do that to a degree of political attack. That said, the fact that both, again, President-elect Biden and a variety of the senior-most leaders in Tehran have said, this is what we want, a compliance for compliance return, suggests to me that the substantive benefits of getting back into the deal are, in the minds of the political leadership, sufficient to work through those political challenges.
But let's talk about the politics of this for a moment. I'm thinking about Jake Sullivan, the incoming National Security Advisor, who, in a somewhat different context, told my colleague Scott Detrow that the new administration wants to pursue foreign policy in a way that is politically sustainable, so that middle-class voters see that there's something in it for them. And you can see the philosophical value of that, never mind the practicalities of it. Just if you want to have a sustainable foreign policy that's not overturned by the next president, you need to have a consensus supporting it, which apparently we don't have. In this circumstance, the nuclear deal was criticized because it was not comprehensive enough, because it didn't limit Iran's activities in the region, because it didn't limit Iran's missile programs. What is a politically sustainable way to go forward? Jared, you can go first, and I invite everybody on the panel to answer this.
Well, I think that we have to kind of maybe imagine both a diplomatically achievable and also a politically sustainable way forward. So, if the objective is what sometimes referred to as a JCPOA plus that goes beyond the nuclear space and that addresses Iran's ballistic missile program and the regional proxies and all of these other points of very realistic and correct concern that we have about Iran's policies, I think that's far-fetched because the structure of the JCPOA, where the United States is giving up primarily economic benefits, I don't think that's going to be sufficient to get Iran to make the concessions that we need in those other areas. So I do think that it proved to be sufficient, and I think it looks like it will be sufficient again to address the nuclear program, which again is I think the program, and for a long time there was strong bipartisan agreement, was the part of Iran policy that is the most direct threat to the United States, to our and therefore very much in the lines with with Jake's idea, I think terrifically expressed, of a foreign policy for the middle class. So what does that, if you can do that, if you can get the nuclear program sort of back into a box, where does that leave you with these other things, with the ballistic missiles in the region and everything else that again there's correct international and bipartisan concern about? Well, one possibility is that you end up with a much broader diplomatic process that draws in actors in the region and addresses regional security concerns. And actually, again, this is something that Jake has written about in Foreign Affairs last year. That allows you to make progress on these issues that from Iran's perspective are sort of core national security or regime security issues. Maybe you can't make progress there. I mean, numerous administrations have tried and failed. And if you can't, well, negotiated agreements with adversaries are not the only tool in diplomacy, right? From the platform of the JCPOA, you could again start working with our allies in Europe, with the Russians, with the Chinese, to try to constrain in some ways the progress that Iran has made on some of these other points of concern that we have. Is all of that enough to win bipartisan support in the United States? To be very blunt, I suspect that has more to do with the partisan nature of American politics and how that evolves coming out of the Trump era than it does with the substance of what I've just described.
Ambassador Jeffrey. Oh, now you need to unmute, sir. We're not hearing you, sir. There we go.
Several points related to this. First of all, I supported the JCPOA back in 2015. I was involved in a Washington Institute review of it that was quite comprehensive. And I and others did so because we thought that it was exactly what the administration had said publicly, that it was a transactional agreement to deal with a specific subset of Iran's threat to the region. I got discouraged over it over time when I felt that the administration was basically saying, the Obama administration, this is the only problem that we have with Iran. We can go back and forth on whether Obama really thought it was transactional or not, or transformational. I will cite his another interview he did around the same time where he said that Saudi Arabia will just have to learn to share the region with Iran. That's a attitude that Iran is not a regional problem. This attitude was not shared by any of the states that I have dealt with in the region other than obviously Syria, and Iraq tries to avoid picking sides on this, but everybody else thought that Iran is a threat to the region and that you can't share the region with Iran. That gets to the core problem with our overall policy towards Iran. One way or the other, the JCPOA, I would say the nuclear file has to fit into an overall package of what is Iran's role in the region. Jarrett mentioned that Iran is also disappointed in the JCPOA even before Trump pulled out. And to some degree, he is correct because, and this gets to the transformational dreams related to it, if you read particularly the economic language of the agreement, there were major promises made to Iran that it would be treated not just like a normal country, using Kissinger's word, but that almost as a favored one, that there would be all sorts of trade agreements and special credits. The European Union went even further than the United States in the text to essentially embrace Iran and reward it for being a good neighbor. The problem is, as I said, during that period of time, it was perceived for good reason throughout the region as not a good neighbor, but as a threat to one another degree, an existential threat to various countries in the region. And they balked, as we know, at the JCPOA in 2015 and 16. And they were, I would say, much, much happier being part of the overall pushback campaign that the Trump administration put together. That's the problem that the Biden administration will have to face. They have a major goal of getting back into the JCPOA, and I can understand why. On the other hand, they have stressed at every single opportunity that I have heard, regardless of who it is associated with the new administration, that they want to work with our allies, that restoring alliance credibility, restoring America's role as a leader of our partners and allies is very important. In the Middle East, believe me, that exists today. What they have to do is be careful that if they rush ahead with the JCPOA, they don't tear that apart.
Robin Wright, Americans talk about restraining Iran's missile program, restraining Iran's wider activities in the region, and I can hear an Iranian official, if there was an Iranian official in this discussion, responding that the very things that you want to stop us from doing are the very things that we have the right to do as an important country and the most populous country and a relatively wealthy country in the Persian Gulf region. What do you think Iranians are willing to do on these other issues beyond the nuclear agreement, if anything, and at what price?
Well, on the missile issue, which is one that's very important to them because they basically don't have an air force. Much of what they have dates back to the Shah's era, very old, held together by paper clips and bubble gum. And so they have relied on missiles for both offense and defense. And so we have to understand the context of that they feel is their right to defend themselves, particularly given the use of aircraft and missiles against them for 8 years by Iraq during what is still the bloodiest war between states in the modern Middle East. But I think they're talking about ranges and limiting ranges, something less than 2,000 kilometers, and they may go more than that. I'm not, I don't know missiles well enough to know what the limits we would feel comfortable with. I think that there is some hope on when it comes to specific meddling, as administrations like to call it, and that is notably with Yemen. This is a war that the Saudis recognize as their Vietnam. They know it's not going to have a military outcome that is going to make it successful for them. The Houthis, a ragtag militia, has managed to survive now, 5 years and 6 years almost, and the Saudis at great expense are very unpopular. The Congress doesn't want to provide them with weaponry. And so I think Yemen is a place that the Iranians have a 4-point plan that they've talked about, a ceasefire, humanitarian relief, the UN goes in, holds an election and so forth, that this backwater conflict to many people in the world is the one where you actually could see some movement, because I think the Iranian attachment to the Houthis is weaker than their attachment to any of the other kind of militias or proxies in the region. So on some of these issues, you could see ideas emerging. The danger is, frankly, more internally in the United States than it is between the Iranians and the Americans, because we, as Jared rightly pointed out, we're so polarized that the idea of any American president of any party lifting sanctions on groups like the Revolutionary Guards or the Supreme Leader's Office or the central bank will become a political football and look like you're caving to a revolutionary regime. It doesn't matter that we have relations with Russia, even though they're hacking us, interfering in our elections. Iran has always been, for 42 years now, the great challenge, because they took over our embassy, and everything to do with them has been shaped by that perception that they made America vulnerable, and they put the world in crisis over that embassy, and it lingers to this day. When in fact, if we were smart and we tried to set up some kind of arrangement where there was a diplomatic dialogue that eventually led to some kind of permanent diplomatic engagement on some of these issues. But it also requires a certain realism. You can't kind of shake the rug and get Iran, ancient Persia, to go someplace else. It existed long before most other countries in the world.
I am about to open this up to audience questions, and I want to remind, we're already getting some excellent questions, which I'm about to turn to. If you have a question, you can send an email to mep@wilsoncenter.org, or you can tweet Wilson Center MEP. So we hope to get some of your questions there at mep@wilsoncenter.org or Wilson Center MEP. But before we turn to those questions, I want to ask one more thing of you, Robin. As you know very well, one thing that has been consistent in Iran throughout all of these decades of conflict with the United States is what seems to be a basic Iranian affection for the United States, which is not necessarily shared the other way. But you talk to Iranians, so many have surprisingly been to the United States, even though it's so difficult to get here. So many have family in the United States. They have warm memories of the United States. They would like to be connected to the United States. That has been a constant. Based on whatever you've been able to report, I know it's hard to truly gauge public opinion. Did the 4 years of the Trump administration change that basic affection at all?
I think there is an admiration of the United States that runs deep, different ways among different generations. There's, my generation, which was, grew up with knowing the Americans, traveling to the United States, being educated in the United States. The younger generation, because of social media and access, very much wants that connection. Still would like to go to the United States for their education. The challenge, I think, is that there is a deep, deep, deep suspicion now that even if you have an administration that at the moment is going to engage, there's a fear that in 4 years you get another president, or 8 years, another president that turns around and flips policy. And I think that's a concern that's reflected around the world. Is the United States credible when it says it's going to do something? President Trump walked away from so many international accords and made that, viable. That was, popular, even among, very popular among his base, large numbers of people. That can the next president, if he wants to do it, walk away from any of these treaties? And that's why Iran has said, look, we want some kind of ratification. We want so that this is permanent part of law, and that a president by executive order doesn't just walk away from it.
Well, let's open it up for questions, and I'm going to give the privilege of the first question to President Harman. Jane, what do you got?
Well, thanks. This conversation is in the tradition of the Wilson Center. It is fascinating. It is deep. Everyone participating, including you, Steve, brings enormous knowledge to it. So let me try a couple things. Number one, I'm from Los Angeles, as many know, and it is also called Tehrangeles. It is the largest Iranian diaspora anywhere. And there, last time I looked, 750,000 Iranians there. It's probably much higher now. Just one comment. The other comment is it's 11 minutes by missile from downtown Tehran to either Tel Aviv or Jerusalem. So that ought to focus the mind in terms of why people worry about Iran's missile industry. But my question follows on what Robin just said. The JCPOA was an agreement, it wasn't a treaty. Why? Because the Obama administration did not think Congress would ratify it. There was huge pushback by some, especially in the pro-Israel lobby, against it. And just today in the press, it's reported that the Israelis are going to launch a lobbying campaign against a new JCPOA, and that campaign will no doubt impact many in America. Sheldon Adelson, the great benefactor of Republicans, died yesterday, but there are lots of people who have very hard right views of Israel who live in the United States and influence the Congress. So my question is, as Congress debates impeachment and Congress is split in so many ways, will Congress be helpful here to an effort to do something, or will Congress block something to do something in the Biden administration?
I'll invite anybody in the panel to pick that up that would like to.
I'll maybe say a word on this question, partially just because I think there's a lot of people have strong views about this question of treaty or not treaty. Of course, the JCPOA was a form of an executive agreement. I just want to underscore that in some ways, this is not actually the key question, right? The Trump administration pulled out of any number of treaties, going back to the Universal Postal Union, which is one of the oldest persistent treaty bodies in the international structure. It's very difficult to ratify a treaty. It requires 2/3 of the Senate. It's actually easier to leave a treaty under our current legal interpretation than it is to change a law, right? So a law requires a new law to be passed by the Senate and then signed by the president. A treaty can be withdrawn by the president alone without any action from the Senate. So the issue here is not so much does a deal with Iran get submitted as a treaty? The question is, does our politics evolve post-Trump in a way that allows some degree of bipartisan realism again, or not? Because this goes way beyond Iran, I think, as Robin indicated. It's how is a new administration going to persuade negotiating partners around the world that we are capable of making persistent policy in the United States? Now, the good news here is that people still need to deal with us, right? I mean, it's very hard to ignore the United States, even if you're not happy with our political system. But the incoming Biden administration, I think future administrations are going to have to come up with real answers to what is a very hard question about the sort of the paralysis so far in our system.
If there are no other responses to that, I can move on to audience questions. Thank you for that observation, Jarrett. The first question on the list here is from C.T. Knight of the United States Air Force, who writes, there have been many protests within Iran in regards to COVID-19 and also about human rights. Is there any chance of an internal change of power or even a potential regime change? What does our panel think?
No.
We'll move on right after that. Now, maybe you should go on. What each of you, what are your reasons for no?
So Iranians are very vocal about their politics, and I think very brave. When you look at what happened, millions turned out in 2009 to protest what they believed was a fraudulent vote. And they have continued in 2017, 2018. There have been some really, nationwide, 30 of 31 provinces witnessed protests. That every time I've been in Iran, there's a small group of, whether it's teachers or truckers or whatever, out in front of parliament demanding, back pay or higher wages or more protections. Iranians it's a very sophisticated polity. And yes, there is deep dissent within the regime, and the regime has been ruthless, brutal in trying to quash it. Very recently, in one of the most egregious acts, it lured an Iranian blogger basically back to Iraq, where the Revolutionary Guards kidnapped him, took him back to Iran. He was tried for corruption on earth, and last month he was executed. This is just, the human rights lawyers who are in prison, it's just egregious. So there is deep dissent. And one of the issues, which may echo a little bit in another country not far from here, is that the debate about whether the supreme leader is above the law, or whether he is subject to the law, and it is how much power does the system have? Is the supreme leader infallible? And so there's some basic questions that are very important. And to get back to what I was saying earlier about the timing of this, the candidates for president and who's popular may well be decided by what the United States does in terms of, did Rouhani's tactic, he's a centrist / kind of reformer, not much of one, but he's kind of a centrist. Did he fail so much that those who are hardline, like former President Ahmadinejad, will the hardline come back into power? Will they be the popular candidates? The Guardian Council recently approved active military can run for the presidency, and there is a former Revolutionary Guard who's now already a candidate. So the politics of the future really can be determined in Washington in terms of who's popular, what ideas. There's just the stakes here are so big that you can't underestimate how important movement is. We're never going to get a regime in Iran that reflects our values, not in my lifetime anyway. The monarchy did not reflect human rights values. The revolutionary regime has not reflected basic American values. But the idea that there is some force inside the country that can topple it is, whatever you want to happen, it's just not foreseeable anytime soon.
I want to invite an analogy here and a comparison, if I might. I will state the proposition, doubtful as it may seem at the moment, that the overwhelming majority of Americans believe in our system and believe in democracy, even with all of our frustrations against it. The reasons I say that would include that so many tens of millions of people voted in the last election, and that even the people who stormed the Capitol last week did so on behalf of a lie. We can presume that many of them believed the lie that a democratic election had been stolen from their side, and that was the lie that the departing president had to tell to have any chance. He could not simply say Trump forever, although we can assume that there was some minority of people that that's all they want, regardless of the means. But it seems that there's broad acceptance of the idea that the United States is and ought to be a democratic system. For all of their frustrations with Iranians, perhaps you'll object, but for all their frustrations with Iran's system, do you believe that Iranians fundamentally accept and believe in the system under which they are governed?
Well, if your barometer is what the turnout is, the Iranian turnout in the last election was higher than it was in the United States. And in the past, there have been times when many Iranians have boycotted. And that's one of the reasons that President Ahmadinejad won, because reformers didn't believe there was a candidate for them. And it taught them a lesson. It's important to get out and vote. So, I will talk to Iranians before elections. They'll say, no, I don't like the system. I don't like the candidates. I'm not going to vote. And at the end of the day, they actually dash down to the polling station just before it closes and vote. So I think there's deep discontent in Iran. There's deep discontent in the United States. So is it a popular regime? I suspect every single Iranian would find something to object to. But would they be willing? We're not at a point where there are the numbers or the leadership or the party. There's no real, opposition except the MEK outside Iran, which is a marginal little cult with a lot of money, but it has had made no real impact on Iranian politics. So you haven't seen emerge the kind of challenge or challenger that would lead Iran in a different direction yet. Maybe down the road, but not yet.
Ambassador Jeffrey.
Let me get back to the original question. I yelled no right after Robin, but I can see that Robin and I have different reasons for no. First of all, from doing this for many years on the ground, including watching East Germany every day, and 4 months before it totally collapsed, nobody had any idea that this was coming. We just don't know what happens in these countries. My second reason for saying no is to discourage questions like that. And that gets to my difference with Robin. If I had to put my finger on starting with China, moving through Afghanistan, Iraq, and the Arab Spring, the biggest mistake we've made in the last 30 years is to think that by burrowing politically and militarily and in other ways into nations and their internal procedures and such, we can shape their futures. We can move them in one or another direction. I think it's just wrong thinking because it gets us into very, very difficult situations. Robin may or may not be right. She certainly knows Iran better than me, that what we do or don't do on the JCPOA could have an influence on the elections coming up. What I will say, however, is that regardless of who wins the elections, what we have seen over decades, but particularly in the last 15 years, is there will be no change in Iran's attempts to ravage through the region. I keep on trying to drag the discussion back into the regional context here with limited success, but I'll try yet again. And that is because not just what some crazy people in the White House are saying, this is what we heard every day when we were in the Middle East, and anybody who is honest that's been out there in the last 6 years will probably have to agree that that's what they heard from the leadership of a large number of countries that we call our allies and Biden calls our allies. They want to see what we're doing against the regional program. If we can get a JCPOA back and still have a Biden administration that acts, not talks, because they're already talking, but acts, on the regional front, I think the JCPOA could be swallowed by the region, swallowed by allies, and probably swallowed by a sufficient bipartisan majority in the United States, perhaps even in the Congress, to at least keep it from being decisively challenged. But if you don't deal with the regional issue, you're going to be back to where we were 4 years ago.
So if you were part of the new administration, let's just think about the implications of that presumption. You're presuming, am I right? Iran is Iran. Iran is going to see its interests a certain way. It's going to try to be active in the region in a certain way. And any US policy needs to take that as a starting point, take that into account rather than hope that that would change. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, to some degree. It's just that the administration, there's ways it can reassure allies. The idea of trying to work something on Yemen actually isn't a bad idea because Yemen is seen as a kind of lost cause by everybody involved. But if the administration continues to act as the last one has, or the one that's going as, decisively against Iran in Iraq and in Syria, and is careful in what it promises the Iranians as part of any negotiation to get them to come back to the JCPOA. But as we've heard, and it's absolutely correct from Jared and Robin, the Iranians are going to demand a lot. And there's a quite strong possibility, because we saw it in the Obama administration, that in order to get the JCPOA, which has a certain almost cult-like or religious hold on people, that we will do that. That will hurt us in the region significantly.
Jared, before we move on to the next audience question member, you know so many members of the incoming administration so well. Do you think or suspect that there are key people in that administration who agree with the regional portion of the Trump administration's approach, that it is necessary and appropriate to be contesting Iran's presence in a number of countries?
So before I answer that question, if I could just quickly firmly agree with what Jim has said, that if there's one thing that we should take out of the last 4 years and the complexity of our politics, it's some humility about predicting, let alone believing that we can influence the course of other countries' politics. That's an idea that should be left in the past. On this, look, I disagree, though, with Jim that I don't think this incoming team has a cult-like attachment to the JCPOA. I think that they have a very practical view that the JCPOA did us good, and that it would be good to go back to it in a pretty clean way. Will that be possible? Is it possible to reach an understanding with Iran that allows a compliance for compliance return? At this point, I think it's not clear, although, again, both sides have sort of indicated that that's what they'd like. From that point, I think it's quite clear that the incoming administration will pay attention to all of the other points of concern that we have, which are basically regional points of concern, right? The nuclear issue is kind of this broad, wholly international issue. The ballistic missiles, because the range is in question, they're regional proxies. These are more regional issues, and they'll require work with our regional partners to make any progress. What I would just caution here is that there also needs to be a degree of modesty or humility in terms of how much progress and how quickly we can make in that area, right? That I don't think that the incoming team sees a lot of success in the Trump administration's policy in the region so far. That doesn't mean they disagree with the diagnosis, which is longstanding. But in my view, certainly at least, part of what the administration has done wrong here is sort of to shoot the moon. They've by setting impossible goals, they've failed to achieve the more modest goals that were actually possible and on the table if you had put a sensible policy together.
Thank you for that. Another question now from Killian Switzer, U.S. Army retired. What is the significance of the administration's current emphasis of Al-Qaeda in Iran, which is something that Secretary of State Pompeo spoke about at some length yesterday?
I can take that.
Go for it.
This is part of as you go out the door, build up the strongest possible case. You see the same thing with the declaring the Houthis terrorists and on several other policies, such as with Cuba and with China. It's an attempt to stack the deck to make it harder for the next administration to reverse your policies. The ties between Al-Qaeda and Iran have long been known, both to the intelligence community and to the media. The point is, these ties are, to use the word I keep throwing around here, transactional in nature. They are not a joint campaign against the United States. They are involving you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. We both have certain interests in common, in particular, making life harder for the United States throughout the region. And we don't want to be waging war against each other. Now, the one exception to this is the version of Al-Qaeda that we saw in Iraq, particularly under al-Baghdadi, which then morphed into the ISIS or Daesh movement in Syria and Iraq, has an absolute hatred of Shia Islam. There is not real links. But in terms of core Al-Qaeda, there were always at least 3 levels of cooperation: refuge in Iran for people, senior, including members of Osama bin Laden's family, passage back and forth that made it hard for us to deter people from going from Afghanistan to Iraq, and very, very limited joint cooperation. Again, this is not a case that Iran should be covered under the authorization for the use of military force in 2001, which some people are arguing. I don't believe that at all. That's not the intent of the administration, and it would be absurd. The fact is that there is some cooperation, but if we looked at ISIS, the Taliban, and Al-Qaeda, basically Sunni extremist violence throughout the region over the past 20 years, we would see a lot of states like Iran that were 85% against, 10% ambivalent, and 5% working with these enemies of us and stability in the region. That's simply the reality of how the region ticks.
A question here from Jesse Plager. I sure hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly. Send word if I'm not. The Levant lead of the USAID Bureau for Humanitarian Assistance. And this gets to the impact on the region of a new administration engaging with Iran in some new way. As the United States attempts in some fashion to re-engage with Iran on the nuclear agreement, what does that mean for Lebanon is the question, where Iran is so influential? I've baffled you all, I think.
No, I'm happy to take that, having lived in Lebanon a long time. Look, one of the things that people don't understand about Iran's connection to Lebanon is that is why Iran became Shiite. And in the 16th century, as the Ottoman Empire was spreading its tentacles across the region, the Persians were very nervous about losing, their millennia-old country, and so they decided the monarchy decided they needed to in some way change the nature of the country so that the Ottomans wouldn't want to absorb it. And how did it do that? Well, it decided to become Shiite. It was a political decision. And where do you go to find people to help you convert a country? Well, you go to Lebanon and the Shiites there. And the Lebanese clerics over the next 2 centuries set up seminaries, helped convert the Iranian society. And so there has always been this existential bond and the sense that the Lebanese help them survive and that Iran has a commitment and obligation to help the Lebanese. And so that's why in 1982, when I lived in Lebanon, the Iranians were the first ones to deploy Revolutionary Guards to help the Lebanese after the Israelis invaded. So, Lebanon is its own sad case now. It is a failing, if not totally failed state. Iran can't bail it out. Iran's in terrible economic trouble and is not in a position. I think one of the things that, to the broader question of the regional impact, we have to remember that going back throughout history, there has been tension between the Arabs and the Persians, and that has nothing to do with whether there are monarchies or revolutionary regimes or elected presidents. That's the way it's been, and that's the way it's likely to be. So whatever happens on the JCPOA will, and the kind of broader region effort to deal with the region, you have to take into account the fact that there are going to be limits of what you can do. And I do think that it's going to be very hard. I think the Saudis and the Israelis and this new kind of power block with the United Arab Emirates, it changes the dynamics, and Jared would be much better on this than I am, but changes the dynamics of what you can do because they will feel more empowered in kind of pressing the United States or standing up to too much change or demanding more issues be addressed when it comes to US policy. But poor Lebanon, I'm not sure that anybody can save it right now.
Jared, she says you'll be much better than she is. No pressure.
Unmute.
I don't have much to add to the way that Robin has laid this out. Again, I think it goes to the point that I tried to make a little bit earlier, which is that the right starting point for all of these challenges is some humility and some honesty about what can be achieved and how quickly. Imagining that more is available is a very, very quick way to a failed foreign policy.
There's another question here now from Asher Orkaby, Princeton University and a Wilson Fellow as well. Thank you for the question, which raises Saudi Arabia. The question is, can Iran-Saudi tensions be accurately described as an Islamic Cold War? There's another question here, which I think gets to the issue of how you reach out to Iran without somehow upsetting or making trouble with this other US ally in the region, Saudi Arabia. How do you balance the two?
Let me take that, Steve, or at least initially. There is a rivalry between Saudi Arabia and Iran. Saudi Arabia as the leading Arab state, as Robin just said, there is tension between Arabs and Persians that have gone back many centuries, and Saudi Arabia sees itself as the leader of the Arab world. There's also a Sunni-Shia tension that was exacerbated by the 1979 revolution. That doesn't mean that is the defining characteristic of the region. The Iranians and the Saudis were not friends before 1979, but both the Shah of Iran and the Saudi kingdom felt comfortable within the United States regional collective security system. Iran today does not feel itself comfortable within the regional United States collective security system. In fact, in every single foreign policy statement I've seen it make, or anybody close to the regime, or even the liberal side of it, like Sayyid Hussein Mousavian, they make it clear they want to end that US collective security system. And that's a fundamental difference between the two. Saudi Arabia is not as powerful a player as it was 10 or 20 years ago. The situation in the Middle East is such that the four key Arab countries, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Iraq, and Syria, each for its own regions, have become less influential in the region as a whole, as they focus on internal problems or specific issues such as Saudi Arabia with Yemen to itself. And that's opened the door to three other powers, Israel, Turkey, and Iran, who've all been relative winners over the past decade. That's another change because that phenomenon, while it's been around for a while, has become far more pronounced in the last 4 years. It's another regional factor that the new team will have to focus on.
Hold on to Israel because we're going to turn to them in just a moment. But Robin, you had a comment. Now, again, you got to unmute.
Let's not forget that until the 1979 revolution, sorry.
Probably just Foreign Minister Zarif. You can take it. It's fine.
I actually do have his number. That until 1979, Iran and Israel were the two pillars of U.S. policy and foreign policy in the Middle East. And after 1979, Saudi Arabia and Egypt ended up taking the role that Iran once played in terms of what were the pillars. And the JCPOA was that moment when Saudi Arabia began to see its primacy, its political leverage began to diminish because they were terrified that Iran was going to become a kind of de facto ally or more important. And when you look at the region, you have a country like Iran, which is geostrategically more important in terms of bridging, what the old Soviet republics, South Asia, Turkey, Iraq, it just has far more geostrategic importance. It has a huge amount of oil, and it has a much larger consumer base in terms of wanting to sell things. The population 3 times. It also has the 14th largest military in the world and largest in the Middle East. And so if you're looking for allies, there are a lot of reasons for people to say, well, Iran, actually, you have more interests and more long-term. And so I think Saudi Arabia, the Sunnis don't like the Shiites. They see them as heretics, always have. There's that element. You have the ethnic element of Persians versus the Arabs. And then you have the even bigger modern issue of which country is more important to the United States. And I think that's really what it comes down to. And somehow in renewing the JCPOA, the US is going to feel challenged, kind of trying to comfort or reassure the Saudis we haven't walked away from them or not about to abandon them. Although, frankly, is Saudi Arabia really a good ally to have? I think that's a question that has to be asked as well.
Ambassador Jeffrey, you mentioned that Israel's position in the region has strengthened in the past decade or so. We heard earlier of already an Israeli campaign to push against a new nuclear agreement or a rejoining of the nuclear agreement. And now we have a question from attorney Ted Kalick, or Kalick. Again, my apologies if I'm getting the name wrong. How will the Biden administration deal with Israel's independent actions toward Iran? Let's just dwell on that word independent. How differently does the current Israeli administration see Iran as opposed to the new Biden administration?
The Israelis see the Iranians as an existential threat to themselves. If there was any doubt about that, Iranian actions in Syria, where they exploited their coming in with essentially revolutionary guards to stop the overthrow of the Assad regime, and then used that platform to introduce long-range missiles and weapon systems that formed, in essence, a second rocket and missile front against Israel, along with the one in southern Lebanon. This has had a profound effect on Israeli strategic thinking. They've also seen that the overall Iranian threat to the region, again, not everybody who's in this conference or listening agrees with me. I'm just telling you not just my views, but the views of every leader among our allies in the region. Iran is a growing threat, or it was seen as a growing threat for much of the last decade. The Israelis saw or thought that the Obama administration, and as I said, frankly, the initial year and a half of the Trump administration, were doing not very much against it. It saw a community of interest with the Gulf Arab states in particular. It already had relationships and very important security relationships, mainly against Daesh, but in the case of Jordan, also against Iran with Jordan and Egypt. And it seized upon that to form these informal liaisons, informal discussions that formed part of the basis for the Abraham Accords. So Israel is now both militarily, with the support of the United States and our military assistance programs, and with its budding, if you will, alliance system in the region, far more capable.
Ambassador, you mentioned contesting Iran's presence in a number of countries, one of which was Syria, where, of course, you were directly involved in shaping U.S. policy. And I have one more question here from Ishan Tharoor, excellent reporter for the Washington Post, whose name I'm probably also getting a little wrong. But the question, if I may summarize it, is how, if at all, did the Trump administration approach to Syria succeed in contesting Iran or pushing on Iran? And what can a new administration do about that?
Certainly, and that's why I chose the term contested. We have not rolled back Iran from any of these regions. What we have done is convince a very skeptical region, the Sunni Arab states, Israel and Turkey, that we actually cared about what Iran was doing, and we were going to contest that. We were going to keep them from moving any further. Again, looking at this in time perspectives, where was Iran in 2013 versus 2018? Where is it today versus 2018? That is the relative success. It's in containment. The other thing is, as Napoleon said, the moral is to the physical as 10 to 1. An administration that shows it really cares about stopping Iran rather than saying it wants to see Iran share the region is an administration that gets taken more seriously. An administration that goes after top Iranian figures that have been the bane of everybody's existence, including putting a missile into my house in 2011, Qasem Soleimani, is somebody that gets a lot of credit in the region. They see the administration taking on Iran. They see Israel taking on Iran, taking out its leading nuclear physicist, and they think that they've got, somebody has their back. It's less important how successful we are in these regions, as long as Iran doesn't seize totally a country, such as Iraq is the one that people worry the most about, as long as they think that people are pushing back. That's the good news for the Biden administration. It won't be that hard to convince countries that they are in the game to contain Iran in the region if they continue the basic policies under Trump. The main problem is, though, that the single biggest tool, the crushing sanctions, which have limited Iran's ability to, as Robin said, rescue a Lebanon in economic freefall or a Syria close to it. That's the problem with going back to the JCPO. It's the money that flows.
I'm going to turn to each of you for a final thought or a final bit of wisdom, but I just want to follow up on this question of Syria so that I understand. Syria is so complicated. The policy had to be so complicated. There were so many parts to it. What part of it contested Iran's presence in Syria, and what was the result?
Certainly holding on to the single most geographically important territory in Al-Tanf along the Iraqi, Syrian, Jordanian border by US forces, where we still are, in the entire Northeast, about 25% of the country, 4 million population, most of the oil fields and much of the agriculture, supporting very strongly after 2018 the Israeli campaign, most of it unacknowledged, against Iran in Syria, in ways that have made that campaign far more effective and have seriously impacted Iran militarily, and supporting Turkey's position in the Northwest to stop the Assad assault that was very strongly supported by Iran to seize Idlib and other areas. In other words, the situation militarily in Syria is frozen. The economic situation of the regime, again, is in free fall. That is to the detriment of Iran's goals to use Syria as yet another, if you will, foothold to expand further into the region.
So let me just, since there's only a couple of minutes left, about 5 minutes left, I want to invite each of you to impart a bit of wisdom to us. And maybe I'll put it in this kind of frame. Suppose that Joe Biden showed up on your porch and knocked on the door and then backed up. He's going to be 6 feet away from you because not everybody has the vaccine yet. But he just shows up and he says, you know, you have a general idea of what I want to try to do. Give me one piece of wisdom about this situation to remember. One fact that I should keep in mind as I attempt to rejoin the JCPOA and do whatever else I'm going to do. And Jared, I'll throw you on the spot first. What's one piece of wisdom you're going to give Joe Biden on your front porch?
I think that the most urgent goal has got to be de-escalation of the crisis that the Trump administration has chosen over 4 years to create and to accelerate. That crisis in the region simply doesn't fit with the dramatic priorities that President-elect Biden has made clear that he understands in the United States. And so I think that fundamentally the idea of getting back into the JCPOA is an effort to get this problem off the front burner for a little while and then try to figure out some diplomatic solutions that can make incremental progress on hard problems over time. And I think that that's his instinct. That's what he's said consistently going back to questions about this in the Democratic primary now more than a year ago. And that's very much what I hope he and his team stick with and find a way to implement.
So back away from crisis, go for incremental improvements. Ambassador Jeffrey, I'll let you go next. What is one piece of advice you're going to give Biden on your porch?
Now it's two. One, don't listen to the people, and there'll be many who, like Jared, who tell you that the tensions in the Middle East are all a result of what Trump has done over the last 4 years. They're the result of Iran's behavior in the region over the past 6 or 7 years. Two, following up on that, there is a contradiction not between going back to the JCPOA, but with the lifting of sanctions and the improved economic position of Iran in the region through that, and maintaining our current partners and allies in the region's faith. Biden has to square that circle. He wants to do both. We'll see how he succeeds.
Robin Wright, Joe Biden shows up at your house there. What are you going to tell him?
So I'd say, think about if you don't make progress on one or more of these issues, what is the alternative? How much worse could it get? Are there dangers of a war between the United States and Iran, which a lot of people in Washington had begun to fear over the last 6 months? And what would it look like? I think there's a broad consensus among those of us who know the region well that a war with Iran could end up being far messier, far costlier than either the war in Iraq or Afghanistan. So there is an incentive to move and to make progress, knowing that this is not a regime we're ever going to like very much. There will be profound differences, but we have profound differences with countries that are in many ways a greater threat to us. But I'd also caution, 4 years may seem like a long time, but time flies literally when it comes to trying to make peace with longstanding rivals. And at the end of the day, I'm not all that confident that we can make significant progress on all these fronts. I think we can erode the tensions on each of them, but coming to some kind of final resolution on all of them, I suspect 4 years won't be enough.
Okay, we have a sense of the difficulties and challenges ahead. I feel that I've learned a lot and really appreciate this discussion. Jared Blank, Robin Wright, James Jeffrey, thanks to all of you. It's a pleasure talking with you, and I hope I talk with you again. And thanks for the questions as well.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you,
Thank you very
everybody.
much.
Have a good afternoon, everyone.